Hello everybody, welcome back to the next segment of our Evolution and Natural Selection lecture. In this particular lecture, we're going to get into listing or describing the mechanisms of evolution, and then get into explaining how natural selection occurs. Right? Time allowing, we will get into comparing and contrasting disruptive, stabilizing, and directional selection. Let's go ahead and get started. So we've defined evolution as a change in the allele frequency of a population over time. So evolution is the result of other processes or other mechanisms. There's actually a number of different ways that evolution occurs. Okay? So when we look at evolution, one mechanism of evolution is known as natural selection. And that would include sexual selection. And I'm making a point of that because every now and then you'll run across a textbook that describes sexual selection as its own category. Natural selection is based on the environment. Okay? Like, that's where the word natural comes in selection, because the environment is naturally doing it. A characteristic that makes natural selection different from the other mechanisms of evolution is that it is the only mechanism of evolution that consistently produces adaptive evolution. In other words, natural selection is the only process which time and time again makes populations better adapted to the environment they're in. Now, there are some other mechanisms that lead to evolution as well. There's artificial selection. Artificial selection is, for example, when people choose which individuals breed with one another to produce organisms that are better suited to human values, needs, or wants. Right? For example, all of our domestic crops were artificially selected from wild ancestors to produce bigger, more desirable fruit or vegetables, right? Or taste better. You know, all the different breeds of dogs, all of our domestic farm animals like domestic cows and horses and such have been selected or have evolved through the process of artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is not adaptive. Right? It generally makes the individuals less well adapted to their natural environment. Right? When Darwin introduced his idea of how evolution occurs, he actually introduced it with an example of breeding domestic organisms, because that was already an acknowledged and widely practiced thing at the time, and so he started his argument out with a familiar concept. Another one is genetic drift. Genetic drift is a mechanism in which evolution occurs through random chance events. We're going to explore this in more detail in a future lecture. Gene flow is also another mechanism of evolution that's due to random events. The random movement of alleles through interbreeding or dispersal of individuals. We're going to look more into it in a future lecture. And lastly, mutation. Remember, mutations are changes in DNA base sequences. And if an existing allele mutates, it could generate a new trait that's never been seen before in that population. And so the arising of a new allele through random mutation does change the allele frequency of a population and categorizes or meets our definition of evolution. Right? We're going to focus on how natural selection occurs. Right? So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a flow chart that kind of puts together the components that are necessary for natural selection to occur and kind of walk you through how they all interact to produce selection. Right? This little thing with the hawk and the bunnies down here, That's just because I will probably at some point need to reference kind of a fictitious example as I'm going through my explanation. The first component that's necessary for evolution through natural selection is a population with variable traits. And what we mean by that is that if you have a population, there has to be differences between the individuals in that population. Okay? In other words, there has to be phenotypic variation in the population. Now, when we look at how organisms can be different from one another, when we look at how individuals within a population can be different from one another phenotypically, they can be different morphologically. In other words, they could have different shapes and colors, right? Like you could have some flowers are red and other flowers are orange within a population. Or you might have some individuals in the population have big ears, some have small ears, right? Some have long fur, some have short fur. Some have brown fur, some have white fur. Those are morphological variations. There can be physiological variations, right? For example, there might be some individuals that are more heat tolerant because of some proteins they make, or you might have other individuals that are more resistant to a parasite or a disease because of some enzyme that they make, right? Or because somehow their cell has a different set of receptors on it. Those would be physiological variations. And in many living things, humans are the primary exception. In many organisms, behavior is highly determined by genetics. And so there could be behavioral variations. You might have some bunny rabbits that run as soon as they see a predator, and other bunny rabbits don't run until the predator attacks them, and others might not run until the predator is a certain distance away, right? Or you could have flowers that bloom in the spring and other individual flowers that bloom in the fall. I know lots of times people don't think of plants as having behaviors, but there are lots of aspects of plant biology that could broadly be described as behaviors, such as flowering times. Now, why is there variation in populations? Because almost all natural populations show variation. Right? Well, the variation comes from two processes: mutation and sexual reproduction. We'll probably use mutation in most of our examples because it's a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more intuitive. When an existing allele mutates, it's possible that that mutated allele could give rise to a new characteristic or trait, right? Therefore introducing variation in the population. Now, because many traits are influenced by multiple alleles, sexual reproduction can also create variation within a population, because sexual reproduction basically rearranges alleles to produce offspring that have unique combinations of alleles, and combinations of alleles that are different from their parents. And so because many traits are polygenic, the reshuffling of existing alleles into new combinations through sexual reproduction can also contribute or serve as the source for variation within a population. Now, variation is not enough. Some of those variations need to be heritable, right? And what we mean by having heritability is that those traits are genetically based, and because they're genetically based, they can be passed to the offspring of the organism, right? So we need a phenotypically variable population, and those phenotypes, at least some of them, need to be heritable. They have to be passed on from parent to child through alleles. The third component is selection, right? Now, what selection is is selection is something in or about the environment that favors one of these traits or some traits over the other traits, right? So one morphological variation over the other morphological variations, right? One set of physiological traits would be more advantageous than another physiological trait, right? And so these traits or characteristics that are beneficial would be called adaptive traits or adaptations, right? Now, when we look at the different things that can be what we call selective forces in the environment, right? Oftentimes, these are the things that are going to kill an organism or influence the organism's ability to reproduce. Because remember, evolution requires reproduction because it occurs from one generation to the next. And so when we look at the types of things that can act as selective agents, it includes tolerance to the physical environment, right? For example, if the environment was really cold and you had long-furred bunny rabbits and short-furred bunny rabbits, right? The long-furred bunny rabbits are probably going to be able to stay warmer, and long fur would be more adaptive, and they would be what we call selected for. So there are these terms. If something is selected for, that means it's adaptive. And that characteristic, or organisms with that adaptive characteristic, are more likely to survive and reproduce. Whereas something that is selected against is maladaptive. In other words, it is a characteristic that is poorly suited to that environment, and those individuals are going to be less likely to survive and or reproduce. So in the example of having a cold environment, and some individuals are long-furred and some are short-furred, the long-furred individuals, which are going to have thicker coats and they're going to be warmer, they would be selected for, and the thin-coated animals would be selected against. Competition is another example of a selective force, right? Resources within the environment are limited. Individuals that are better able to compete and therefore access the required amounts of food and liquid and nutrients and shelter, those individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce. If an individual has a morphological, physiological, or behavioral characteristic that makes it poorly suited to compete for its needed amounts of resources, then that individual is more likely to die and not reproduce. It's being selected against. Disease and parasites are selective agents. There are going to be some variations within a population that could potentially make the individuals that have them more susceptible to disease and be selected against, or less susceptible to a disease and be selected for. Right? Predation, right? So like you look at these bunnies down here, right? They differ in fur color, which is a morphological variation. The predator, it's going to really be able to see the pink bunny rabbit and the green bunny rabbit, and even the white rabbit's pretty easy to see. And so these are more likely to be killed and eaten, and they would be selected against, whereas the rabbits with fur that blend in more with the environment, they would be selected for, because that's adaptive and they're more likely to survive and reproduce, right? Now, when you have all of these events occurring together, right? A population with variations that are heritable and can be passed on to offspring, and some of the individuals in this population reproducing more than others because of the characteristics that they have, that results in what we call differential reproduction. Differential reproduction refers to the fact that the individuals who are able to reproduce are those individuals that have traits that are selected for, or in other words, traits that are adaptive to that environment, right? To use the example of the bunny rabbits at the bottom of the screen, right? If the green bunnies and the pink bunnies, if a lot of them get killed, that means there's going to be very few pink and green bunnies having babies, right? Which means the next generation is going to have very few pink and green bunnies. But the brown bunny and the tan bunny, right? They're well camouflaged, and they're less likely to get eaten by the hawk. And so you'll have a lot of brown and tan bunnies survive. And you have a lot, and therefore you will have a lot of brown and tan offspring in the next generation. So if the green bunnies are contributing very few offspring, and likewise with the pink bunny to the next generation, and you have the brown and tan bunnies contributing lots of offspring to the next generation, then what that means is you have the adapted individuals, and I'm just abbreviating individuals, INV, okay, having many offspring, okay, and remember those offspring have alleles, and so assuming that fur color in this example is genetically determined and heritable, you're going to have an increased number of brown and tan bunnies in the next generation, right? I'm just going to abbreviate B and T, or brown and tan with their first letters. You're going to have more brown and tan bunnies in the next generation, and therefore more brown and tan alleles, and you're going to have less green and pink bunnies in the next generation because very few of those survive to reproduce, and therefore you'll have very few green and pink fur color alleles. And so if the frequency of the brown and tan alleles increases, and the frequency of the green and pink alleles decreases, then what you've had is a change in the allele frequency from one generation to the next, and that is the definition of evolution. Right? But keep in mind, evolution doesn't occur until, or evolution follows reproduction. Right? It's happening in the next generation. Right? So we only have... we'll stop here. It's 18 minutes.